I'm Tisha Bader. Welcome to our series Durban Revisited, discussing the World Conference on Racism that met in Durban, South Africa from August the 31st until September the 8th of 2001, which was undermined by hateful anti-Semitism. The United Nations, nonetheless, is marking the anniversary of Durban on September the 22nd. We hope that each of these programs, which we are presenting together with B'nai B'rith International, serve to illuminate a different element and perspective of what happened at Durban and why, and to address the issue of anti-Semitism today. Here with a panel of experts is David Michaels, Director of UN and Intercommunal Affairs at B'nai B'rith International.
Thank you very much, Tisha, and thank you all for joining us today for this latest installment on the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism, its fallout and lessons. To discuss the Durban Conference and all things related, I'm pleased to have with me a panel of eminent figures, each bringing their own distinct vantage point to this timely conversation. From the United Kingdom is Ruth Baroness Deech, an academic, lawyer, and bioethicist who is a member of the House of Lords. From Azerbaijan is George Deek, Israel's ambassador in Baku and his country's first Arab Christian ambassador. From Israel is Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who serves as deputy mayor of Jerusalem. She is also the co-founder of the UAE Israel Business Council, a lawyer, and the founder of a strategic communications firm. And from the United States is Ellie Cohanim, the former U.S. Deputy Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism, who has also worked as a broadcast journalist, including here on JBS, and as an executive at several major Jewish institutions. Thank you all for being here. To begin, let's go to Baroness Deech. Lady Deech, you've had a front row seat not only to anti-Zionism and anti-Israel sentiment in Europe, but to the manifesting of such sentiment explicitly as anti-Semitism, often targeting ordinary Jewish citizens. Violence by anti-Israel extremists has long necessitated extraordinary security measures on the part of Jewish institutions in France, Belgium, Sweden, Germany, and even the UK, while there is little to no comparable history of attacks by pro-Israel activists against European, Arab, or Muslim citizens. How do you explain this reality, and how do you interpret Israel's popularity problem even among some fellow democracies that have contended with terrorism or extremist violence?
Well, I think if I can relate this to Durban, what Durban did and continues to do over the last 20 years has been to mainstream opportunities for the United Nations, for other states, and in particular, the United Nations Human Rights Council, to allege that the Jewish state is a racist state and apartheid regime. Now, the Durban strategy, which has continued to spill out over 20 years, has a two-pronged approach. The Palestinians have hitched onto the worldwide popular narrative of racism against people of African descent. To be against Durban is to be racist, imperialist, and unsympathetic to the victims of racism. By wrapping up anti-Semitism with general racism, that submerges anti-Semitism. It's given people a free pass to attack Israel and to attack Jewish populations in countries the world over. And this I blame largely on Durban. It was not a failure, unfortunately, it was a success. And although it's happening again this autumn, and my country, I'm glad to say, along with 10 other welcome civilized countries, is boycotting it, the danger is still there. And I have to say this, though this will not make me popular, I think, with your panel. It could not be more apt that we are meeting in the middle of the Afghanistan debacle and betrayal. It's led by the Biden administration. And although the USA is going to boycott Durban, it did sign, in fact, it led the joint statement on countering racism and racial discrimination from the UN on the 19th of March, which got this off the ground. With its abandonment of Afghanistan, return to funding the UN Works and Relief Organization and the Palestinians, its return to the Human Rights Council, its appeasement of Iran. And I think this is all part and parcel of the fallout from Durban. And I'm sorry if I have offended our American audience, but this is how we're seeing it very clearly today in Europe. And it's all part of the same abandonment of victims, turning racism on its head, ignoring what's done by Muslims and extremists, and focusing only on the Jews and Israel as a worldwide scapegoat.
Deputy Mayor Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, we know that you may have to leave us just a little bit early, so I'd like to get in a question or two to you now. Despite all the tension and sensitivities surrounding Jerusalem, many don't realize the uniqueness in historical terms of the religious freedom and diversity in the city over its years as Israel's capital. In fact, although the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is the most sacred site in Judaism, Israel has long maintained Islamic administration of that compound on which the Al-Aqsa Mosque is situated. This is something that simply is not known internationally, as notable as it would seem to be. How challenging is it for Israel to balance different communities' needs and, frankly, demands in Jerusalem? And what do you make of the effort by Hamas, which, of course, controls Gaza, and incidentally, to Lady Deech's point, had congratulated the Taliban on its return to power and prominence in Afghanistan, their Hamas attempt to attribute its most recent attacks on Israel and hostilities with Israel to Israeli policy in Jerusalem?
So thank you so much for the question. Thank you for inviting me on this wonderful panel with Ellie, Cohanim, who I consider a friend, and Baroness Deech, who I had the pleasure of meeting a couple of years ago, and of course, Ambassador George Deek, who makes us proud here in Israel. I have to say, Jerusalem ultimately, is a city which is a city of diversity, a city that we're proud of its diversity. We have 40% Arab population, 25% ultra-Orthodox, a few percent Christians. So it's a very diverse population, and it always has been in thousands and thousands of years of history. We're one of the oldest cities in the world. And so if you look at Jerusalem as a city, what we do in City Hall is try and improve people's lives day to day, try and bring opportunities for all. We have many, many social gaps. Nobody's denying that, but we work towards that every single day. The problem in Jerusalem is when Iran and Turkey and Hamas in Gaza try and conflagrate their political agenda on one city, on a city that is trying to do its best for its population, for all of my constituents. That's the problem. And unfortunately, the best example of this was the last conflict that we saw. Now, is there a problem in Sheikh Jarrah? Yes, there was a problem 40 years ago in Sheikh Jarrah. It's a court case going on for 40 years. Did it have to happen that week? It was a deliberate, invented provocation. In Jerusalem, do we have problem of freedom of worship? No, not at all. In Temple Mount, throughout Ramadan, every Friday, we had 100,000, 120,000 worshippers going up to a Temple Mount, to Haram al-Sharif, to pray for Ramadan. Not only that, we facilitate freedom of worship by providing buses at the different checkpoints when people cross over from the Palestinian Authority. The Jews are the ones who actually can't go and pray in Temple Mount because, again, we don't want to make these provocations. The provocations are invented by the radical elements in not just Israel and the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip, but all around the world. This is a proxy. Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood is a proxy of Iran. Let's not forget it for a second. And so when I look at Jerusalem, I look at the Jerusalem from above and the Jerusalem from below. The day-to-day life in Jerusalem is one of a shared society. Like I said, there's still problems. Absolutely. There's problems in any big city in the world. But we work really diligently every day for opportunity in quality employment, for better opportunities in education, for the young Arab kids in our city, for the young ultra-Orthodox kids in our city, because these are the two most socioeconomically most marginalized population groups. On a higher level, everybody's trying to bring into their political agenda to our city. And that is very difficult, very, very difficult to separate these two things. But all we can do is try and improve people's lives. And that's what we do. And slowly, we're building such great bridges between East and West Jerusalem, between the Arab populations, between the leadership in the Arab populations who have a direct channel to myself, to the mayor, and to so many people who are dedicated to improving their lives and developing East Jerusalem economically. And this is what we're doing every single day. And so because I know what goes on a day-to-day, I have no, when these things happen, I know they're external influences, because internally we are really moving forward. And that's exactly what bothers the radicals. What bothers Hamas is that we are creating fantastic bridges. What bothers Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood is the Abraham Accords. What bothers Hamas is that Ram, which is a Muslim Brotherhood light party, holds the balance of power in the Israeli government. That bothers the extremists. It's the normalization that they're fighting against at the moment.
Well, Deputy Mayor, you've rightly made reference to the diversity of Israeli population in general, and I think that's something we'll pick up again in a bit, I hope, with Ambassador Deek. But one more question for you about the diversity of Israel's Jewish population. You know, the insult added to injury, if I can put it that way, of anti-Semitism is all too often a denial of that very anti-Semitism. In fact, a denial of Jews' very identity, history, and sense of belonging. A common perception and claim among some still in the Middle East, amplified in settings like the UN's Durban conference, is that Israel is comprised entirely or overwhelmingly of European Jewish settlers who essentially colonized Palestinian land, but also that it's merely Zionists and not Jews who have been unwelcome in the region. As a Mizrahi Jew, as a Jew of Middle Eastern origin, would you say that the history is more complex? After all, it seems telling, and I know this is not anything new to you, that over the same decades, when the population of Palestinians between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea has increased sixfold, the number of Jews in Arab countries has plummeted from at least 850,000 to fewer than 5,000. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, absolutely. First of all, what we know is that there's so much ignorance about the history of the Jews, about the history of Israel, about the history of Zionism. Is most people are just totally ignorant or holding on to 15-second, sound bites and memes, that are completely false and misleading. Of course, we are from this region. We're indigenous to this region. And we've been dispersed and have come home again with a constant Jewish presence here for thousands and thousands of years. That's the reality. What is very poisonous is this kind of, they call it intersectionality, which means that if you are this and this, you have to be this. In other words, I am a woman, and I'm Israeli and I'm a Zionist, so I have to be a fascist. When I say I'm a feminist and I'm an Israeli and I'm a Zionist, they're like, no, you can't be a feminist if you're a Zionist. What we've seen in the last few months is that this whole, we're not anti-Semitic, we're anti-Zionist, is complete rubbish, because ultimately in the last few months, we've seen Jews being attacked in the United States. In Europe, we always had a bit of a tolerance for this, but we've seen the continuation of Jews being attacked. Nobody's asking them, are you a Zionist or you're not a Zionist? So what we really do understand is that anti-Zionism is a woke and politically correct way of being anti-Semitic. And anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred of all time. And of course, in order to justify this hatred in the world of hypocrisy and double standards that we live in, So, Jews are white colonialists, when of course, Jews come in different shapes and sizes and different colors from everywhere in the world. Myself and Ellie is an Iranian woman, and my mother's Moroccan, and I'm a Spanish Moroccan Jew. And so that doesn't fall into this kind of intersectionality. Hang on, you can't be a Jew of color, and at the same time, also, you can't be a Jew of color because Jews are not of color, Jews are white. And so we have all this kind of falseness. And of course, ultimately, the underlying thing is in this kind of binary world or non-binary world of woke world that we live in, it's still about the oppressor and the oppressed. And the Jew, because is perceived as, hardworking and prosperous, God forbid you should be the oppressed. And so there's only one place to put the Jew, and that is as the oppressor. And that is an irony, as I see it, that in this non-binary world where you can be a million colors of everything, you can't be a Jew who also suffers discrimination. And that delegitimizes anti-Semitism. The delegitimization is that you can't punch up. You can only punch down. And of course, there's Jews, like I said, in all types of situations, in all types of discriminations in the world. But that's how it's perceived because that fits into their narrative.
It's interesting, Deputy Mayor, that a friend of mine, a Jewish friend of mine, was recently approached by a well-meaning, very, very highly educated friend, a self-identified progressive, in fact, an academic himself, who had told him, in all innocence, I don't get along well with Zionists, which might be akin to telling a woman in the 21st century, and I defer to those of you who are women on our panel in particular, telling a woman in the 21st century, I don't get along well with feminists. But I think that truth might be lost on many today. Ellie Cohanim, you served the previous U.S. administration in working to combat anti-Semitism globally. As you know, the U.S. State Department was among the first major international institutions to make use of the IRA, or International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working definition of anti-Semitism, which did, importantly, acknowledge extreme anti-Zionism or anti-Israel sentiment as contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. What part does the Durban experience, but also the broader history, both in and outside the UN, of efforts to equate Zionism with racism, play in your view of modern-day anti-Semitism? And do you see the primary threat of anti-Semitism today as coming from the far right, the far left, from religious extremists, or some combination of sources?
Well, in the Trump administration, we were very clear that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and that was our policy. And the way that this policy played out was, number one, we supported the state of Israel. The Trump administration understood that a strong state of Israel ultimately leads to a decrease in anti-Semitism in the world, because the Jewish state is the defender of Jews all around the world. And it's also the place of refuge for Jews. So when you look at a country like France, when you look at Europe, all over Europe, where Jews are being physically assaulted and attacked, and unfortunately sometimes even killed by anti-Semites, you're finding that these Jews are taking refuge in Israel. The second leg of our policy was also creating policies within the United States where we acknowledge that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So specifically, if you look at the 2019 executive order to combat anti-Semitism, where we adopted the IRA definition, as you just referred to, of anti-Semitism for all US executive agencies, as well as creating a legal avenue for college students on American campuses who, as you know, college students today, our Jewish college students, are on the front lines of the battle in anti-Semitism. And so we created a legal avenue for college students to have legal recourse when they are indeed facing anti-Semitism on campus. Also, I just want to point out our policies in the United Nations, where you saw our ambassadors at the UN really taking the United Nations to task. So to your question about the UN, look, the UN was created with the most, I think, most idealistic beliefs. And sadly, it's unbelievable to look at the history of the United Nations and to see how it has over and again singled out the Jewish state. So whether it is the Zionism is racism resolution, which was passed, in the 70s and took so many years to get that resolution reversed. Whether you look at the Durban conference 20 years ago, which is being planned again for this fall, all of these things, whether you look at resolution after resolution that singles out only Israel, when we are seeing countries like Syria that gas its own people, the Chinese that are committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslims, the Iranians, which are committing heinous human rights violations against their own people. You look at what's going on in the world and you see this obsessive focus with the one Jewish state of Israel, with the one real democracy in the Middle East. And it's just impossible not to draw the conclusion that unfortunately too many countries in the world do have this kind of obsessive anti-Semitism. And that's exactly what we saw in the first Durban conference. And I would tell you that it's time not only for every country in the world to boycott the upcoming Durban conference, but truly the United Nations should remove this stain from itself and cancel the Durban conference. That is the right thing for the United Nations to do.
Well, thank you, Ellie, for that. And needless to say, we know and worked closely with representatives of the previous administration, most notably Nikki Haley at the UN, among others, and we certainly appreciated all of the important efforts that were made. And at the same time, I just want to acknowledge, without taking away the freedom of expression of our panelists, that neither JBS or B'nai B'rith, of course, as nonprofits, are affiliated with one side or the other of the political spectrum. In fact, our members and certainly our viewers are Republicans, Democrats, and everything in between in the American context. I'd like, on that note, to actually ask Ambassador Deek, before we get to your own current post, an important one in Azerbaijan. Ambassador, I know that you know the United States very well firsthand, and it's reflected in your mastery of the English language, as well as more important metrics. One of the concerns within the mainstream Jewish community, but also among our many friends in the United States, is the degree to which support for Israel and support in this context for the vital U.S.-Israel relationship has become politicized, made more partisan, become more polarizing. Needless to say, I think all of us would agree in the long term that it's important for that relationship and for any support that Israel is fortunate to have in the world to be preserved over the long term and not simply on one side of a population or a society. So what are your reflections on reasons why this issue may be becoming a bit more partisan, and what can we do to ensure that support for Israel is seen as the vital moral imperative that it is?
Thanks, first of all, for having me here and being with such great panelists, and for the question. And I think it very much relates to what we've referred to before about the vilification of the idea of the Zionism, which is the basis, the ideological basis of Israel. And I think we should make no mistake, is Zionism, is anti-Zionism truly anti-Semitism? I personally believe so, because if you look at history, when religion was the main source of morality in society, the Jews were hated because of their religion. Starting from the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment period, during the Enlightenment period after the Middle Ages, the main moral source of society was science, and then it moved from religion to theories of race. And today, when it's no longer politically correct to hate a people for their religion or for their race, today Jews are hated for their state. So the reasons change, but the hate stays the same. And what you referred to about the polarization touches very much the tactics. If you look at how the Jews or Israel in this sense people tried to isolate it, you would see certain stages. First, in 48, 67, 73, Israel's enemies tried to put it in a military crisis through existential wars, and they failed. Then they tried to put Israel in an economic crisis through the Arab boycott, and they failed too. Then they tried to put Israel in a political crisis with the notorious UN resolution, which we just discussed, equating Zionism with racism. They failed again. And then they tried to put Israel in a security crisis by waging waves of terrorism, Second Intifada, and after the Intifada, and that has failed as well. And today, they're trying to put Israel in a moral crisis, and I think this is what the Durban conference is about. By blaming Israel for all the sins of human rights, bringing good and well-meaning people to question Israel's right to exist. Now, when I look around in the Arab world and I ask myself, were 1 million Jews expelled in the 40s and 50s because of anti-Semitism? No, it was because of anti-Zionism. But still, despite everything I said, even if we would accept for a second the notion that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, does it make anti-Zionism okay? I mean, what is Zionism? It's a movement, an ideology that gives the Jewish people, for the first time, a sense of agency, that they can influence, they can shape their fate, that they have a say on whether they live or die. And Jews, do Jews not deserve the same liberty and dignity in Israel, while enabling Palestinians to maintain their own liberty and dignity as well? I mean, how can we, as Arabs, as Palestinians, seek and fight for the right of Palestinians for self-determination while denying the exact same right of the Jewish state? And here I come to what it actually means to have a Jewish state. For me, at least, a Jewish state is a place where every Jew, regardless of his geography, and every Israeli, regardless of his religion, can call a home. It is the one place in the world where the Jewish people can have a national home, and the one place in the Middle East where minorities, like Christians like me, can live their faith without fear. Israel is where a Christian boy can wear a cross, and a Muslim girl can wear a hijab, and a Jewish kid can have a kippah, all at the same school, like it was in my school in Jaffa, without that fear. And we've seen judges, and tonight, actually, after we finish here, I'm going to watch Kochab Baba, which is like A Star is Born, where an Arab singer is going to, from Jaffa, by the way, from my community, Valerie Hamati, is going to perform, and maybe she'll win the contest like other Arabs before her. So I think this is what Israel is, and this is what Zionism stands for me. Your next question was, what can we do? What can our response be to those efforts to isolate Israel, to polarize, and to put Israel on the defensive on that agenda? Well, first of all, I think that we need to work together. As someone who spent considerable time of my life among Jews in Israel and apparently outside, I can attest that Jews may pray, Adonai Roi, the Lord is my shepherd. But I have to say, I've never met a Jew who was a sheep. Yet, when you face an organized global campaign of demonization, we have to learn to overcome the differences, whether within the Jews or between us, Jews and Arabs who care, who believe that Jews have the right to be different and have a state of their own in the Middle East. We have to come and work together. After all, how can we expect others to support us if we are unable to support one another? You mentioned my experience in the US. I remember I was driving once in New York, or rather I was driven in New York, and I saw an ad, and the ad said, you have a friend at the Bank of America. And my friend, who was from Israel, who was next to me, he read it, and he said, yes, but in Bank Leumi, you have a mishpacha. So, yes, we are a family. We are mishpacha. Are we argumentative? Probably. Are we dysfunctional? Occasionally, but still a family. And I think that once we join hands, great things can be achieved. Secondly, I think that we must make new friends and allies. We cannot be left alone as Israelis, as Jews who care about Israel, in the battle against delegitimization. We cannot be left by ourselves. It just can't be done. The hate cannot be stopped only by the hated. The victim cannot cure the crime. We need friends and we need allies. And in order to win those friends, and many of you here have been in the front line doing just that, we need to speak about the story of Israel in a new and more inclusive way. We need to explain to people that the right of Israel to exist is not because it is against diversity, but it is exactly because Israel represents what it means to be different, represents diversity in itself. Throughout the ages, the Jews were hated precisely because they were different, because they were the most significant non-Christian minority in Europe. And today, they are the most significant non-Muslim minority in the Middle East. In Europe, Jews paid a price for not giving up their connection to their God. And today in the Middle East, they pay a price for not giving up their connection to their land, to their home. So why should this matter to us who are neither Jewish nor Israeli, if we're talking to people from the outside? Because we are all different, and being different is what makes us human. Every culture and every faith are unique, and each of us is irreplaceable. And the key message is, a Middle East that has no room for Jews is a Middle East that has no room for humanity. I've been watching the pictures coming out of Afghanistan in the last few days, and I've seen the horror, and I've seen women afraid of the oppression that awaits them. I'm not talking about the fear of Christians, because in 2010, there are no Christians left since 2010 in Afghanistan. And I think that when we watch this, after the horrors of Syria and the persecution of Christians and Yazidis who were killed and enslaved, and when we see today in Afghanistan that the main victims of Islamic violence are Muslims, I think it becomes clear to everyone that at the end of the day, hate destroys the hater. And from being a home to some of the world's most ancient cultures, the Middle East is now turning to a place where there's no room for anyone who is different. And therefore, the key message of Israel is that we all must stand together. We have to fight for the right of all Christians everywhere to live without fear, with the same passion that we fight for the right of Jews to live without fear.
Thank you.
And we need to fight Muslims, we need to help Muslims lead the fight against Christianophobia and Judeophobia, not just Islamophobia, because nothing less here is at stake than our shared humanity.
Thank you, Ambassador. And as you alluded to, in addition to your being distinguished as one of Israel's youngest ever ambassadors, you do come from the country's Christian Arab community. And to go to Azerbaijan very quickly, and I would ask all of us to try to keep our responses as succinct as possible so we can get to as many questions as possible in the time remaining. You do hold a particularly important post, both strategically and symbolically, representing that only Jewish state in the world to an overwhelmingly Shiite Muslim state, bordering, among others, Iran. At a time when Israel often is not sufficiently recognized for its democracy, for its continually growing Christian and Muslim populations, especially its continually growing Muslim population, why is it that, in your view, that some take issue with the state's Jewish identity and symbols when they don't object on principled grounds to the identity or symbols of dozens of Christian or Muslim states? And switching gears, what does the strength, I had the privilege, as I mentioned to you before this broadcast, of visiting Baku not too long ago. What does the strength of Israeli-Azeri ties, in addition to the recent Abraham Accords, suggest for the potential for relations between Israel and other Muslim states?
I think if you would come to Baku, you said that this has happened. I think you would see here the community that couldn't be further from anti-Semitism. In Azerbaijan, you have the biggest Jewish minority in any Muslim country. And this is the only other Shia country than Iran. And I think this country presents a good example of tolerance and coexistence with the Jewish people. And not only they do not mind having Jews among them, they are very proud of the Jews who live here. Some of the greatest scientists like Lev Landau and Elazarov who come from Azerbaijan are Jewish. The national war hero of Azerbaijan, who has a statue in the middle of Baku, is Albert Agarunov, a Jewish tankist. So this is something quite remarkable. And when you think about it, coming from a Muslim country, a Shia Muslim country, it's really unprecedented. And I think that this is a good example of, it's not a matter of whether the Star of David or the anthem or whatever disturbs you, is whether you are willing to accept that Jews deserve the right of self-determination like any other state. And I think what is happening now with the Abrahamic Accord is that more and more Muslim countries, mostly Arabs, but not only, are coming to terms with the idea that, yes, the Jews are a minority in the Middle East, but they have a right to exist, and they have the right to be here among us and preserve the right and their dignity of being different. And I think that's the major change that has been happening. And, you know, I've walked here meeting people and talking to people in the streets of Baku, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, I'll skip the part that I'm very confusing to them, because I say I'm an ambassador here. They ask me, are you Muslim or Christian? I say, no, I'm actually a Christian. And then they say, okay, so which European country do you represent? And I say, Israel. And that's quite confusing to some people. But nevertheless, when they know that I come from Israel and that this is the country that I represent, they are extremely happy and welcoming, because they see Israelis and Jews in general as their brothers and their partners. There has been no hostility. It's one of the few places in the world where Jews have never experienced any pogroms or persecution or violence, at least not by the local. I'm not talking about the invaders. So in that sense, it's a great example that anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, or any kind of hate, regardless of what kind of anti it is, doesn't have to exist. There is another way, and I think you can see it here, and I welcome you all to see it live here in Baku.
Thank you. Going back to Lady Deech, Lady Deech, you had mentioned earlier that we're coming up on the 20th anniversary, not only of the Durban Conference, but of 9/11, the event that truly confirmed a sad era of global terrorism and also of global efforts against religious intolerance of the most extreme sort. And the United Kingdom, of course, is a critical partner and ally to the US and others in this effort. As an already somber milestone now does perhaps become even more somber with that reascent that you referenced of the Taliban in Afghanistan, what is your prognosis for containing the distinct threat of religiously motivated political extremism? And I would just add very quickly that on the Shiite flank of the diverse and expansive Muslim world, Iran has just installed its own ultra hardline president, Ibrahim Raisi, and perhaps hardline is an understatement, even as the question of that country's nuclear aspirations remains unresolved.
Yes, and unfortunately, President Biden seems to be going along with creating another accord with Iran, and we know it's not worth the paper that it's written on. I want to make 2 points. One is pessimistic and one is perhaps a little optimistic. There are, I think, 30 or 40 Muslim states in the world. And apart from the one where we see our ambassador now, hardly a single Muslim state in the world is living in peace or is not persecuting its minorities, whether it's Afghanistan or Yemen or Lebanon or Syria or Egypt or Indonesia. Nearly all of them are terrible examples of how states can crumble and behave in that way. And unfortunately, there is a fundamental flaw in the structure of the United Nations. There are something like 190 states, and they have one vote each, whether they are large or small. And most of those countries that vote are not democratic. They are authoritarian. They have skeletons in their cupboards. They are persecuting, they are causing trouble. And yet they have a majority that can outvote small countries that are living peaceably and trying to promote diversity, like Israel. So although Ellie said, the UN should cancel this conference, I don't think it's going to happen. One could ask America to bring forward a vote at the Security Council, maybe to stop it, but you won't get a majority in the UN to do anything favorable to Israel, because they've all, well, many of them have got their own agendas. They have their own terrible histories, which they're trying to disguise by projecting their own sins onto the state of Israel. Now, let me give you a note of optimism also, though it hasn't happened. I think the cure for all the ailments that we've been talking about in this session is education. Now, education about Jews has gone wrong. Around the world, there are more than 300 Holocaust memorials, and in many countries of the world, the Holocaust is taught. But that is all that young people ever learn about Jews. All they learn is that they were killed by the Nazis in Germany, and that was a long time ago, and it's got nothing to do with them. And it manifests itself on campus. If young, ignorant people want to upset Jewish students, they start drawing swastikas and saying, did the Holocaust ever happen? That's all they know about us. What they need to know, as the ambassador said, we need a proper Jewish education. Where did the Jews come from? Why is Israel their land? Only theirs, no others. What is the reason for having Israel? Why have people hated Jews in different ways over the ages? Again, as the ambassador explained, and as our sadly deceased late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said, first of all, it was our religion, then it was our ethnicity, and now it's our state. You can only get people to understand what's going on by education. I would like to see a worldwide effort amongst all civilized states, get a proper education about Jewish history on the curriculum of every school. Stop focusing on the Holocaust, those terrible photos. We know it's in our hearts. We know what happened. It's preserved. But people need to know now, why was there a Holocaust? Why do people still hate Jews today? And that means asking some very difficult questions about religion, about science, about geography, about national politics, and about religious persecution even today. We've got to have proper education. On our BBC, our world-renowned BBC, they're not very good on this at all. They take a very narrow approach, and so do our British schools. Time for a change there.
Well, I would note on the UN. Thank you. That to take the Human Rights Council itself, of all UN bodies, and other bodies are bad as well, but one would hope that an institution as critical and as focused on human rights as the Human Rights Council would be above the politics, above the prejudice. And unfortunately, as I think all of you know very well, and probably many of our viewers, Israel is the only country of all 193 member states at the UN to be targeted for perennial condemnation by a standalone, dedicated, permanent agenda item. And not only that, but the Durban Conference, the subject of our discussions these coming weeks and right now, the Durban Conference, of all of the UN's myriad conferences, only the Durban Conference has an additional dedicated standalone agenda item at the Human Rights Council. But I'd like to pick up on something that Lady Deech had said in turning to Ellie Cohanim. Ellie, a few countries, or in the case of the European Union, a regional bloc, now have, as you know, designated point people dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism or preserving Holocaust memory. Even the UN, for all of its many flaws and problems that we've spoken about, now has a focal point for addressing anti-Semitism in addition to a program for Holocaust remembrance. And that important IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which we discussed earlier, has been recognized now by at least 36 governments. But is all of this making an impact where it really matters among anti-Semites or potential anti-Semites? Is to take the point of the Baroness, is commemoration of historical anti-Semitism, even a critical event like the Holocaust, a modern event, a cataclysm like the Holocaust, is it becoming easier to commemorate anti-Semitism of the past relative to combating anti-Semitism of the present? And is the U.S. truly getting, from your experience working at the State Department, is the U.S. truly getting the support it needs from other countries in tackling this scourge?
When we were in the State Department, myself as the Deputy Envoy to combat anti-Semitism, one of our top priorities was, in fact, advocating for governments and all institutions to adopt the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism with all of the definitions underneath it, which clearly spelled out that targeting Israel is anti-Semitism. So this was a priority. My hope is that Deborah Lipstadt, who has just been nominated for the position of the Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism by the Biden administration, that she too will take this priority. And earlier you mentioned the question of partisanship in the United States on this issue. Look, the reality is that the majority of American Jewry still votes Democrat. So while I myself am a Republican, I certainly do hope that the Democratic Party will continue to support Israel, will continue to combat anti-Semitism. What we're seeing right now from the leftist fringe of the Democratic Party, so whether that's AOC, that's Rashida Tlaib, it's Ilhan Omar, the squad, and the rest of the members of the squad, is that over and over again, they make these slanderous accusations against Israel, calling Israel an apartheid state, accusing Israel of committing genocide. We saw this on the floors of Congress in the last Gaza conflict. And so what I think behooves American Jewry right now, the vast majority, again, who are still voting Democrat, who are supporting the Democratic Party, is to hold their elected leaders accountable, because we certainly need Israel to be a bipartisan issue, and we need anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Semitism to be a bipartisan issue. And so again, I really call upon everyone who's watching right now, who is a Democrat, to hold the party to fire and really make sure that we keep Israel and keep anti-Semitism a bipartisan issue. It really shouldn't be that only the Republican Party is willing to go to bat for Israel and for the Jewish people, but that is a trend that we're seeing right now. Now, in terms of whether the United States has the support that it needs, the United States is really, historically, we've been the moral voice on the issue of Jew hatred. And I think, again, the question that we all need to ask is that starting today and going into the future, will the United States maintain its moral authority? Will the United States continue to, again, fight anti-Zionism, which is the new anti-Semitism? And of course, my hope is, yes, as I expressed, I hope that this is a bipartisan issue and that we will see administration after administration continue to take this moral authority and really make clear to the world that, again, the singling out of the Jew among nations, which is the Jewish state of Israel, is as unacceptable as the singling out of the Jew.
Thank you. Thank you. And Ambassador Deek, going back to you, and again, since we only have just a couple of minutes remaining, if you could keep your response as short as possible. You have already distinguished yourself as a representative of Israel, but as we mentioned, you are a member of a religious and ethnic minority in the country. Has your community been supportive of your professional path, and do you feel challenged by any of those church denominations, particularly the ones with members in the Middle East, that have negative views of Israel?
Well, I'll start with the church part. In Israel, I haven't been challenged by churches. I don't think church in Israel the church institution itself is as politicized that it is in the US. However, when I was in America, I've even participated in conferences of the Presbyterian Church and others where resolutions were adopted singling out Israel, blaming Israel for all the possible sins of human rights, which for me as a Christian felt quite shameful. As for my own community, some people agree with what I do, some people don't. But my father used to tell me, if everyone loves you, you're probably not doing anything significant. If everyone hates you, you're probably doing everything wrong. So if some people love you, some people hate you, you're probably on the right track. So I live with that. But I can tell you that my main struggle, even in my own community, where I have a lot of people supporting what I do, is always to maintain the possibility to argue together, to disagree about anything, but in a way that the argument that we hold is seeking truth and not power. And that means, and that's the idea behind what I do, because I myself, my father used to be the head of the Balad Arab Nationalist Palestinian Party in Jaffa, and here I am as an ambassador in Israel. And when I joined the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I asked him if he would be okay with what I do. And he said, George, my job was to teach you how to think and not what to think. So if that's what you believe in, go for it. And I think that embodies the idea of arguing for the sake of truth, an argument that seeks to enlarge both sides, where we can both gain something and learn something new. Whereas an argument for the sake of power, which is very much what is happening in a polarized society. You mentioned the squad, Ellie mentioned the squad before. It's an argument that doesn't seek to learn something new or to seek some kind of truth or to get enlarged, but it seeks to humiliate and to admonish the other side. And in that kind of argument, basically both sides lose. You either lose the argument or you lose an opportunity to learn something new. And therefore, it doesn't really matter if people agree or disagree with me in my own community or outside my own community, as long as we can argue, seeking truth and seeking to understand and to learn. And as long as this is in our heart, then it doesn't really matter what people think, because truth and dignity is all that matter in that case.
Well, Ambassador, as someone speaking for myself who's followed the question of the Presbyterian Church USA and its posture on Israel going back to 2004, certainly empathize with you and know the position that you felt yourself in, even as a non-Christian myself. And it's sad, given how intertwined the history of Judaism and Christianity are or is in the land of Israel. So we certainly hope that all denominations can find a way to express sympathy for Palestinians without neglecting justice and the rights and sympathy for the Israeli side and the people of Israel as well.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. On that final note, and we have perhaps 30 seconds, Ambassador, I wonder if you could speak very, very briefly to the issue of endemic Palestinian incitement to hatred and frankly, violence against Israelis and Jews in school textbooks, in religious sermons, on official television. This is something that gets very little attention abroad. It's much easier to notice and to condemn Israeli military responses to terrorism than the day-to-day incitement that fuels the conflict. And I think it's fair to say that this incitement not only is dehumanizing for Israeli Jews, but it hurts the lives ultimately both of Israelis and Palestinians. Who, in your view, is in a position to restrain this fanning of the flames?
Do you know how much money the Palestinian Authority spends on rewarding murder and hate? About $350 million every year. And I once made the calculation, and that if you would stack this sum of money on $1 bills, it will reach a height of 22 miles high. That's 4 times higher than the maximum altitude airplanes can fly. You can circle the entire Earth 3 times with that pile of money. Isn't that disheartening that the government, which is supposed to build the foundations of peace for our children, invests its money in teaching a culture of hate and violence? I don't think any child deserves to live like this. And isn't it outrageous that when a terrorist kills an Israeli, he is rewarded with praise and money? As if the other side is not really interested in peace. It seems like the culture of hate keeps growing and growing. And the money that goes from there goes from the international community. Some of it not even through the Palestinian Authority, but through UNRWA, which is another crime against the Palestinian people, because they print their own textbooks, which are they teach children from them in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the Palestinian Authority, and elsewhere. UNRWA is the refugees agency for Palestinians specifically. And that's the tragic part, because the international community, and we spoke before, the Baroness mentioned the UN, is precisely funding an agency that has a purpose to perpetuate the conflict, to perpetuate victimhood, rather than solve the conflict and bring us to a future of peace and coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians. And I think the international community, that's what I do as an ambassador. I ask them to hold those that get their money accountable, whether it is the Palestinian Authority or whether it is the UN. I'm not gonna preach Qatar because they have a different a set of values when they send millions of dollars to Gaza. But at least countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, European countries, and others who send money to UNRWA, who send money to the Palestinian Authority, should do something about it and make sure that their money doesn't go for hate, but for peace.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. And really, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I know we could go on for so much longer, but I'd like to thank each of our panelists for taking the time. Ruth, Baroness Deech, Ambassador George Deek, Deputy Mayor Fleur, Hassan-Nahoum, and not least Ellie Cohanim, for a stimulating conversation, which I know we'll be continuing. I'd also like to thank the entire team here at JBS and B'nai B'rith, and especially Richard and Phyllis Heidemann, and Millie and Larry Magid, for making this segment possible. We certainly hope you'll tune in again for our full series, Durban Revisited. In the meantime, please do visit b'naibrith.org or our social media channels for ways to get practically involved on the issues we've discussed today. From New York, I'm David Michaels. Goodbye for now.